This is Stephen Houghton with the 1215 Project. This is my third video on English constitutional development and its effect on the Constitution and laws of the United States. When we had last left off, Henry VII had just passed away in 1509. But importantly for where our story is going now, he had been predeceased by about 7 years by his son Arthur, who had represented a union of the families of Lancaster and York, the descendants of John of Gaunt, the two rival lines that had fought in the War of the Roses, which had been a nasty and vicious civil war. And so by his conquest of England and then his marriage of Elizabeth of York, he had united the lines of Lancaster and York and brought the war to an end. And his son, especially his eldest son, he named him Arthur for a very good reason, reaching back to the past and the mythical past, but to an idea of the Union of England. So he had married Arthur to Catherine of Aragon in the hopes that that would then cement an Anglo-Spanish alliance against France. But within months of their marriage, Arthur had died, and Catherine always claimed that the marriage had not been consummated. In any event, Henry got a papal dispensation to allow his younger son Henry, the future Henry VIII, to marry Catherine of Aragon, but had then not gone through with it. Some people think because his wife had also died not long after his eldest son, and some people think that maybe he had considered marrying Catherine. In any event, also, Henry was still too young at that point. He wasn't 14 yet, which was the age that the church required people to be before they would be married. So, in any event, the point is he did not marry Catherine of Aragon, neither had Henry yet by the time that Henry VII died. So Henry VIII decides to go through with it. It's clearly an advantageous marriage, and he wants to do it. And of course, there's a long involved story with a lot of this stuff, right? I mean, you could talk about his 6 wives, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But the real point, for the purposes of our story, is that Henry VIII wanted desperately to divorce Catherine of Aragon because she and he were not cross-fertile. They had, I think, she had 6 pregnancies with him, and none of the children lived even a single year. And he claimed in any event that he had become convinced that this was because his marriage was unlawful and illegitimate and God was punishing him. In any event, whether it was to flatter his own vanity or more likely because he realized that his death without issue could very well lead to the resumption of the civil war that his parents' marriage had ended, he was desperate for an heir. Now, I mean, kings are always desperate for an heir, but with him it was almost pathological. In any event, he decides he has to divorce Catherine of Aragon. And there's a problem. It's not, first of all, the Catholic Church, the Church doesn't allow divorce. For those who think it's just Catholics, I should just add, Protestant churches didn't allow divorce for the most part until the mid-20th century. In any event, that could have been solved. They could have gotten a papal dispensation, except for the fact that his father had gotten the papal dispensation in the first place to allow them to marry. So it would have put the Pope in the awkward position of having to contradict himself if he now granted a divorce on the grounds of too close consanguinity. And also the Pope was very much dependent at this point on the Spanish crown. So it would both be awkward for him because he'd be contradicting himself, and it would be awkward because it would piss off one of his most important supporters. So he couldn't get a papal dispensation. Henry then decides that what he's going to have to do, despite the fact that the Pope had granted him the title Defender of the Faith because of his opposition to Martin Luther, Henry decides that what he's going to have to do is declare himself head of the Church of England. But, Henry is a king, and, that's good and that's important. But the Pope is the Pope, and a Pope is above a king. And so he needs more authority if he's going to challenge the authority of the Pope and make himself supreme head on earth of the Church of England. And fortunately for him, there is another source of authority in the realm of England, and that's the Parliament. And so Henry goes about calling for a new Parliament, what comes in retrospect to be called the Reformation Parliament. That was in 1529. And that year, they abolished the canon criminal law. The following year, they abolished appeals outside of the realm. That means appeals to the church courts outside of the realm. But 1534 was the big year. Peter's pence, the tax that supported the papacy, was abolished. Parliament and the king agreed to his divorce of Catherine of Aragon, and he was declared supreme governor on earth of the Church of England. So, what this does, though, is, though it's by no means Henry's intent, he has now, put the Parliament on a sort of the same level as himself. I mean, if Henry plus the Pope, if Henry plus Parliament are equal to the Pope, then Parliament's pretty important. It's kind of hard to miss. So, that is clearly not his intent. He is the first English king to explicitly state that he rules by divine right. But he has really set Parliament up as his equal. So Henry was not trying to increase the authority of Parliament, but nevertheless, the fact of the matter is, during this 37 years of his reign, he called 9 parliaments. Now, this is, as I mentioned, part of a trend of the downward calling of parliaments, though, in fairness, there were 28 sessions. And sometimes when you look back at older records, you're like, okay, so back then they were just calling new parliaments, and then later they kept calling the same parliament back into being and calling that a new session. So, which is a perfectly legitimate difference, but you have to be careful not to trip yourself up about that. And so Henry, and I guess I should probably mention, one of the things that he did that was really significant for our country, for the United States, not just for England, is that he had appointed Thomas Cranmer Archbishop of Canterbury. And he was, a reformer and the last Archbishop of Canterbury, though, interestingly, to receive the pallium from the papacy, though at the cost, basically he received it because Henry paid a lot of money to allow him to receive it. But the point is that that Thomas Cranmer has had a massive effect on the language, the English language, on on the religious customs of America, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. The whole marriage ceremony, which, if you watch any mid 20th century Hollywood film that includes a marriage, you might as well just whip out the Book of Common Prayer. And in fact, amusingly, if you go to civil marriages in a lot of states, even today, they're basically just excising God from the words of the Book of Common Prayer marriage ceremony that was written by Thomas Cranmer and performing it that way. So it is fascinating the effect that that appointment by Henry VIII had. In any event, when he dies in January of 1547, he leaves his 9-year-old son, Edward VI, as the King of England. Now, obviously, at the age of 9, it was not Edward that was ruling England, it was his regents. And of course, they needed parliamentary authority, as regencies always do, though they did have, they had been validly appointed by Henry VIII's will, so they were not, it's not like they were usurped, not like some cases where, the nobles were usurping power, they legitimately had it. But they did call parliaments. They called basically on average one session for every year of Edward VI's reign, because he never reached his majority, sadly. He died at the age of 16. And then he was rather tragically followed. Oh, I should mention that it is during Edward VI's reign that the English Reformation takes a more radical turn. It is during his reign that the Books of Common Prayer are actually published, even though it was his father who had appointed Thomas Cranmer Archbishop of Canterbury. However, what I was going to say, so the Reformation had continued and, in fact, become more radical during his reign. Some of the really iconoclastic portions of the English Reformation really occur during the reign of Edward VI, and of course then later during the Commonwealth. But the problem with that is that his sister, who is next in line, his oldest sister, who's next in line to the throne after him, the Princess Mary, when Edward VI dies in July of 1553, it is his sister Mary, known to history as Bloody Mary, who comes to the throne. The reason she is known as Bloody Mary is because the Princess Mary the First of England, well, her reign begins thusly. Her brother, realizing that she is a Roman Catholic, and in fact a very strong Roman Catholic, if you think about it, the Protestant Reformation in England had basically been held so that her father could divorce her mother. So for her, it wasn't just that she'd been raised a Catholic, but for her it was personal. And more than that, her brother, Edward VI, on his deathbed, had basically tried to bypass her, though in their father's will, the succession was very clear. It was Edward VI, then Mary, then Elizabeth. On his deathbed, Edward VI had tried to displace his sister, and had named the Lady Jane Grey, one of the great granddaughters of Henry VII, to be and her male's heir, her heir's male, pardon, to be the holders of the crown of England. That lasted 9 days, and Mary closed that down very quickly. And interestingly, I think with the support of Elizabeth, her Protestant sister. In any event, we don't want to overdo the religious aspects of this. I mean, it is important, but what we're here to talk about is constitutional development. And during Mary's reign, Parliament did continue to be called, though, as with all the Tudors, not so frequently. But I think one session every year of her reign is the right thing. And she didn't reign for very long. She reigned for 5 years. And when she died, then her sister Elizabeth Gloriana comes to the throne. Good Queen Bess comes to the throne in September of 1533. And you could say a lot about her. I mean, there's the Armada, the famous privateers, but as much as I sometimes can't help myself from talking about that sort of thing because it's so interesting, what we're sort of here to talk about is constitutional development. And so the main thing to say about Elizabeth I is that her reign continued the trend of having fewer parliaments called. That she was a particularly notorious example because she only called 10 parliaments with 16 sessions over the 44 years of her reign. And the reason she was able to do that is because she had found a new source of income. And that new source of income was patents. Now, we think about patents as something that you get a patent when you've made a new invention, and then no one else is able to use your invention without paying you for a certain period of time. But that's the reformed or modern form of patent. Originally, a patent was just a royal decree saying you and only you had the right to sell X, whether it was wool or wine or whatever. And it was a form of a way of raising revenue. You would say, you know, obviously it was a valuable thing to be the only one able to sell hats or whatever in a certain place. And so that was a strong source of revenue for the late Tudor monarchs. But, I mean, it was really an innovation of Elizabeth's reign. Um, and so while Good Queen Bess was a good queen, and you know she did a lot for England. But from our point of view, what she really sort of does is store up trouble for the future, because this is something that's going to blow up over the next four reigns. Um, so that's, you know, of course you could talk all about the negotiations of her never occurring marriage, but that doesn't really have any real implications for constitutional development. So um, that sort of ends this section on constitutional development. I'm notoriously bad at predicting what I'm going to talk about next, but I am thinking maybe I will do the Second Amendment next, not the whole thing, not the historical part, but use it sort of as a way of talking about uh, the text and the context of itself. Um, like which, when you look at other provisions um, of the Constitution, does that, you know, how does that influence one's interpretation of a particular section like the Second Amendment? So that, I guess, is it for now. I hope you enjoyed and have a nice afternoon.